Right. Welcome everybody to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. It's Friday, January 5th, and we're here this afternoon to pick up work on charters that were introduced to the committee while they were referred to the committee at the end of the last session. And so we didn't have time to do those, and we're going to do intros and walkthrough of these three this afternoon. So we're starting with S-141. And Senator Renner, if you would like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the Fairfax charter change.
Thank you. For the record, Irene Renner, Senator for Chittenden North, which is a new district, including Milton, Westford, and part of Essex, but also Fairfax, which is not in Chittenden County. And I'm here today to talk about Fairfax. There's a fire district that was chartered in 1995, for which the paperwork has been mostly lost over time. It is a rural water municipality with approximately 30 houses, and it's located in the northwest corner of Fairfax. I'm going to leave most of the details to Emily Morgan, who is here with us via Zoom. Thank you, Emily. She is the clerk, and she's going to testify to the changes to Title 24. Tucker will also give details on, and that's all you need to know from me for now.
Great. And I guess the one question I have for you is, I know this passed the Senate already. We're used to starting the charter process and sending them over there. So it's a little unusual for us to have a Senate charter bill. But my understanding is that the as introduced passed the Senate and is now before us.
It is indeed. And, we just like to mix things up.
Great. All right. I'm going to tell Senator Hardy not to make a habit of that. Great. Well, thank you very much. I think what we'll do, Emily, is have Tucker do the official walkthrough of the bill, and I'm happy to give us kind of the detail and background and help us understand it better, if that makes sense. Great. So Senator Renner, feel free to stick around if you'd like, if you have time.
Thanks.
And I'll invite you to switch chairs with Tucker Anderson, and we'll hear the official walkthrough.
All right, good afternoon and welcome back. Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. You have in front of you S-141, a very simple bill, maybe we'll say, with an interesting background. Senator Renner did a great job of introducing it and some of the issues here. To start with your observation that this is a Senate charter bill, which is unusual. The only reason that's unusual is that the House is so nice to charters. And that's you have a special rule that says that charters can be introduced at any time in the session, which is why they start in the House, because often charters are passed by the municipalities at town meeting day, which is after the drafting and approval deadlines. So the House takes control by default of all the charters that come late in the session, but not this one. As Senator Renner pointed out, this is going to codify a charter for Fairfax Fire District Number 1, adding a new chapter 511 to Title 24 Appendix. It has two sections. The first legally recognizes the existence of the fire district. That section 1 simply states that it's going to continue to be a fire district as it is presently established. And it was approved, as you see in section 1, in 1997 by the voters of the district. In section 2, the boundaries of the fire district are established, and this represents, from the best that I can tell, the current boundaries of the fire district current. Takes effect on passage. You're familiar with that in your work with other charters.
Any questions for Tucker? All right. Thank you very much, Tucker. I want to welcome Emily Morgan. Would you like to introduce yourself and how you got involved in this particular charter bill? And thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thank you all for having me today, and thank you, Tucker, for presenting. And truly, thank you to Senator Renner for representing us through this matter. This is my first time working through state government to make something happen for my neighbors. As Senator Renner mentioned, we do serve about 30 households. Originally, we served 46 households in Northern Fairfax. So this neighborhood started a fire district back in the 90s to be able to govern an organization that was originally the Windtop Water Association, which was basically a bunch of neighbors trying to get water in an area that is unique in its geology and access to water. So they built a community well and then learned about fire districts and tried to form one in order to better serve our needs. I became part of this organization haphazardly almost 2 years ago, and then was elected officially as our clerk, and I act as the Prudential Committee president for our organization. We are an aging water system, and a lot of the folks in our neighborhood don't have access to or the money to be able to afford to make their build their own wells, which may or may not hit water due to our unique geology in this area. So it is really our mission to be able to provide safe, clean, and consistent water to our neighbors. We've been doing our best to reduce costs, but we are dealing with infrastructure that is sometimes in excess of 40 years old. So we really need to pass this charter so that we are a legal entity, so that we can actually seek state and federal grants to help us improve the system and keep clean, safe water going to our neighbors.
Any questions for Emily? Okay. Representative Waters Evans.
Thank you. I always have a question. Can you explain how the paperwork got lost or like what happened? Just asking out of curiosity, say.
So there were 2 floods that have affected our records. There was a flood in our pump house, which is actually where we have our water storage and pump from our well. We have pressure tanks up there. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but everything was soaked. They tried to save and preserve things, but nothing was really able to be retrieved. There was also a flood in the basement of our former clerk, who also held records. Unfortunately, when this district was formed by my well-meaning former neighbors, they didn't really follow all of the steps. They had the select board approve the formation of our fire district. And I don't know in memory of the neighbors, and I've talked to many of my neighbors about this. Nobody remembers whether or not we got the petition signed by 20 households. And the town has no record of that petition, of the petition with the 20 households that wanted to form it, or our bylaws. I have since corrected that, and they now have our most current bylaws as well as our rules and regulations on file. They did have boundaries of our fire district, and I was able to go through town meeting notes and select board meeting notes from the early 90s into the mid 2000s, and all I found were 3 documents, one of which I sent over, and I believe Senator Renner might have copies of a couple more. I'm happy to send them to whoever would like to see it, but it's 1 or 2 lines in select board meeting notes saying that we proposed that this was formed and then it was approved by the select board.
Thanks.
And so am I understanding correctly that it was never chartered as a municipality by the General Assembly?
Correct. There are 2 ways to form a fire district in the state of Vermont. One is through charter, which is where we're at right now. The other is through select board approval of a petition of 20 members of the district region, and then recording. The first meeting has to be announced and then started by a select board member, and then all of that has to be recorded with the town, and those steps seem to have never happened, or the town doesn't have our records. So we're kind of going with option B with you all today.
Any other questions for Emily? All right, so our plan, assuming that no one raises any alarms in the next few days, is to pick this back up next week. And I think I put these on for Wednesday. So we will have this on our agenda for markup and vote for Wednesday, and we'll be making that agenda public this afternoon. So great. Well, thank you all very much. Looking forward to helping you resolve this issue and hopefully being able to keep your water clean and flowing for folks in your neighborhood.
Much appreciated. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks for joining us. Right. So we'll put a pin in S141 and come back to that on Wednesday for a markup and vote. So thank you all very much for that. Next up, we are going to take H516, which is an act relating to approval of amendments to the charter of the city of Essex Junction. And Representative Dolan, you're going to be kicking us off.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can. So Representative Karen Dolan, one of the representatives from Essex Junction. Regina Mahoney, City Manager for Essex Junction. And so I'm just gonna pick it up and then hand it over to Regina, who really has a lot of information. And my understanding is that Regina has also shared this with the committee assistant. So there is a posting online, I'm guessing. But this committee probably very familiar with thinking about, or the previous committee, last biennium, did a lot of work with the Essex Junction charter and really appreciate this. That was the heavy lift. Like, this is really the housekeeping to that. And that's the goal that we're trying to achieve today. And I'm going to let you take it from here. Yeah, thank you. So essentially, there are 3 sections of the charter that the voters approved to amend last spring. And the first one is in terms of holding other office. So Essex Junction benefited from a really fantastic health officer for 40 plus years. And when that person resigned, as folks know, that position falls to the head of the legislative body if you don't have anybody else to fill that role. So this current charter says that you cannot hold employment while you're a city council member. That makes 100% sense, and you don't want to change that unless required by state statute. So in the future, if we have to be in this position again, that should not be a problem. The second change to this same section, section 206A, really just removes a time frame distinction between getting off council and being able to have employment with the city. So the vote counts are in there for that particular section for your information. And then the second amendment is to the moderator, section 302. So this was essentially similar language to what the moderator did in the village charter, and really reflects a time when actual town meeting hand raising is the way that the votes were happening. We now operate by Australian ballot. And so the moderator doesn't play that same role. So that's what that amendment is for. And again, you've got the vote counts for that change as well. Then lastly, section 401. So previously, the way the annual meetings happened between the village and the town is that the village held their annual meeting traditionally in April so that village residents could also attend the town meeting on regular town meeting day. So the current charter has the village voters having to set the annual meeting by vote the whole year beforehand. What is likely to happen now, possibly, is that the village will move to town meeting day for annual meeting, but we're in a bit of this transitionary period where we want to align with the school district, who's also adjusting based on this change between village, town, and city. And so the language here is for the council to set the annual meeting date by January 1 of each year, rather than having the voters set this annual meeting an entire year beforehand, which eliminates our ability to stay on at the same voting day as the school. And again, the vote counts are there as well.
Great. Representative Byron.
Hi, thank you. I just had a quick question about the no former council member language. Was that just kind of reevaluating the structure of this, or was there a real life instance where you ran into a snag with that?
It was just reevaluating this section. One of the council members did some research that it isn't a typical year-long time frame in other charters. And the city may be in a position at some point in time that a former, we want to be open to any great employer that would be best suited for the city. So, yeah.
Anything else, either of you want to tell us before we have Tucker walk us through the language itself? All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Tucker, do the switcheroo again. Thanks, Tucker. Welcome back.
Gotten an excellent introduction to H516, so I'll run through section 2, which contain the operative sections of the bill, the amendments to the city's charter. First, in section 206, this is, as was stated, adding a clause to the opening sentence which would restrict council members from holding any city employment during their term of office, to allow a city council member to hold employment if that is allowed by state statute. I don't want to be too picky, but based on the testimony that I just heard, some of this language could probably be a little tighter, a little more nuanced in this section, because this clause would more likely allow employment as long as it wasn't prohibited by state law, which means that this is essentially aligning city office conflicts of interest with state statutes governing conflicts of interest. So the health officer example, that would actually be an example of where duties required by law fall upon other officers. It's not necessarily an instance where a city officer is allowed to hold multiple forms of employment with the city. So the situation that was described is covered by this, but this is actually a broader allowance than the situation that was described. I don't know if that's a problem for the city or not. But again, what this clause would do is allow a city councilor to hold employment as long as it's permitted or allowed by state statute. Which in broad terms, we can go over the conflict of interest statute at another time, but it's very permissive. So
I will tell the committee preview of coming attractions. You all know that we had recommendations coming and the drafts are about to be circulated actually of recommendations for us to do a committee bill on the State Ethics Commission. We will definitely be taking a look at that in this context. I don't know, Tucker, if there are probably lots of different ways that charters get at this. Just depending on when they were drafted. Am I right about that?
yes, and many of the charters simply state that the city or town will have basically a personnel policy or a conflict of interest policy that's adopted by the legislative body. It is otherwise consistent with state statute, but could potentially be more restrictive.
And this wouldn't really be in conflict. It's just a little bit of a different way of getting at that.
This is essentially squaring the city's specific counselor conflict of interest policy with state law.
Any questions about the 206 section? All right, let's keep moving.
The end of that section eliminates, as Representative Byron pointed out, the 1-year restriction on city employment for people who have left their office. That was kind of a do not compete clause built into the city's charter. Interesting for their council members. Section 302, as was described, switches the moderator from an elected position to an appointed position. And section 401, for purposes of setting the date of the annual meeting, shifts that from something that the town decides by vote to something that the city council does by their vote and initiative. And H516 is set to take effect on passage.
Representative Waters.
Thank you. When you say annually on or before January first, what would be before January first?
Any date preceding January 1st.
Like in that year, like zero?
You can't go.
You have to do it on January first. So why,
On or before covers the 24 hours of January 1st in a given year.
okay, thank you.
You can't let midnight toll. It's on January's.
11:59, you can set that date.
Yeah, I guess another way to get that though is this doesn't inadvertently require that the city council only set the date on January 1st. They could set that date at any time before January 1st.
Of the coming year.
Right. I think there's a way Representative Waters Evans and I could read this where we are essentially restricting the city council to having to set the date on January 1st. I just want to make sure we're not doing that.
That is what my understanding.
Yeah.
It's not gonna happen in the previous year.
You have to meet. City council must meet on New Year's Day.
If it's the whole previous year, then why wouldn't you say it between January first and December 31st? I don't know.
Yeah.
It just seems like
As long as
it's
you
saying
can reassure us
something.
that we're not forcing the city council to meet on New Year's Day, I'm okay.
As
Yeah.
long as January 1st of the year that the annual meeting is going to be held does not expire, the city council can set the date. They don't have to meet on New Year's.
Okay.
Are you okay with that? Representative Waters?
Sure, you could decide right now for 2027, but as long as it happens by the end of the first on 2027, January 1st, 2027. Okay, good. Thank you.
Any other questions on construction's charter proposal? Okay. Representative Dillon?
Yeah, so with that piece, the first section that, how will that be established or figured out? It seemed like there was some concern that it may be fitting, it may not be fitting, or.
I don't think it's in conflict. So I think what Tucker's saying to us to think about the comparison of all the charters that are out there in the world is that you could tighten this up a little bit. So it looks, but it's not, the language isn't even problematic.
Okay.
So I'm, unless anybody on the committee disagrees, I'm not going to wordsmith that particular one, but I just wanted to make sure it wasn't gonna cause any problems or look radically different or function differently from the way other similar provisions work with other charters. Depending on when the charter was written, there's so many different ways of getting at the same thing in so many charters, and Tucker tells us about the nuances of each one very expertly every time we do one of these. So that's a great question.
Perfect, thanks.
You just went deep into GovOps nerddom.
This is where we shine.
Yeah, this is really, yeah.
They just feel like that's relevant. Charter.
Little step. Yeah. All right, so now we are, and gosh, we're running 5 minutes ahead of time. We're now going to switch gears. Oh, and before we do switch gears, similarly, we are going to come back on Wednesday. We have 5:16 scheduled for markup and vote. I don't anticipate changes given the conversation we just had, but if we get any giant red flags or someone has a last minute question, I always want to give us a little bit of time to do one last pass. So we will be back at it next week and hopefully get it on its way. All right. Next up, we'll be taking up H518, an act relating to the approval of amendments to the charter of the town of Essex. And Representative Black, thanks for joining us.
Just in last year, you thought you'd heard enough from Essex and Essex Junction. So for the record, Representative Melissa Black, I'm introducing to you today H518, which adopts changes to the charter of the town of Essex. And I am the co-lead sponsor. I want to recognize also Ray Garofano, Representative Garofano, and Representative Leonora Dodge. Also, we are three lead sponsors of it. Okay. So These changes primarily were necessitated when the former village of Essex Junction voted to leave the town of Essex and incorporate as a city in April of 2022. In August of 22, the town convened a committee to propose amendments to the town charter. And these changes were presented to the select board in December of 2022. Several public meetings, public information, 5 articles were presented to the voters for us to vote on at town meeting in March of 2023. So the bill before you is essentially these 5 articles that we voted on. I'm going to let legislative counsel obviously explain and walk you through this. I'm just going to summarize. I was going to summarize the vote totals, but I noticed that Andy Watts provided you all with the vote totals. I'd be happy to do that. So in the first section of the bill, it allows the select board to create ordinances meant to protect tenants from eviction without just cause. And the town vote on this was 570 to 383 in favor. Also in section 107, it allows the town to set various fees for its licenses. The vote on this was 748 to 197. Also in section 210, it establishes a procedure in which to recall select board members. And this vote was 666 to 266. The remainders of section 1, 2, 3, and 4 just generally reorganize the charter as was recommended by the Charter Review Committee. And the vote on that was 770 to 162. And finally, section 5 transitions our current zoning board adjustment to now a development review board. And that vote was 763 to 175. So I'm going to let other witnesses explain more of this to you in detail because they're the ones that did the heavy lift and the work on it. And I'm just going to say on behalf of myself, Representative Garofano and Representative Dodge, that we urge you to move forward expeditiously with this much needed charter update to the town of Essex. Thanks.
Thanks for being with us. Any questions for Representative Black before I let her go? And we have legislative council do the walkthrough next, and then we have some other folks from the town. All right. Thank you, Representative Black. Feel free to stick around.
Thank you for having me. I may stick around for a few minutes, but I do have to get back to the group.
So I'm going to invite Tucker back to do the walkthrough since I know he's time limited, and then we'll hear from the other witnesses.
All right, here we go. Moving along so quickly this afternoon. H 518, Town of Essex Charter Amendments. Let's start with section 1, section 103, which is on page 2. This adds a new subsection E to section 103, which would allow the select board to adopt by ordinances protections for residential tenants from eviction without just cause. You should be familiar with just cause eviction ordinance proposals. There's one in H 474, which is City of Burlington charter amendments. And I think you've seen that at least once a biennium for the last 2 bienniums. Biennia.
Representative.
Tucker, I'll just have a question right off on that. So you mentioned the Burlington Charter, but the Burlington Charter was pretty specific in its details. This is not. So how can we justify consideration of this? It's really all. It's an open-ended authority by the select board. Or Burlington was specific.
I can't comment on the justifications for moving this or not moving it or any of the policy considerations behind it. You are correct that the proposed new subdivision 67 to section 48 of the Burlington Charter was more comprehensive. And it did have specific restrictions built into the just cause eviction ordinance authority, including defined terms and very specific provisions and protections for property owners who meet certain criteria. There were also some procedural elements built into that proposed ordinance authority. You are correct that this is a more general delegation of legislative authority around this particular issue. And the authority to define the terms that you define for purposes of the City of Burlington Charter would here devolve upon the legislative body of the town of Essex. It would be granted broader authority to adopt a just cause eviction ordinance. All right. Section 107, as Representative Blagg touched upon, this is the license fee power that is being built into the charter here. This would allow the town to adopt and enforce ordinances for the purposes of regulating, licensing, and fixing reasonable and necessary fees for an enumerated list of town powers, and also for any power that the town has from general law. We'll start by stating that this is taken directly from the Town of Berlin Charter, word for word. Town of Berlin is the only chartered municipality in the state that currently has this authority. It is clearer than what is built into general law authority under 24 VSA section 2291, where it's a little confusing as to whether municipalities have the authority to issue licenses and permits and collect fees for those licenses and permits when they otherwise have regulatory authority. The reason that's confusing is that the General Assembly, as it amended 2291 over the years, would occasionally state expressly, hey, you're allowed to issue a permit or a license when regulating this particular subject. And in some cases has said, you're allowed to assess this fee for the license or permit that you're issuing. And because of that level of specificity here and there in 2291, many municipalities assume that if it doesn't say you can issue a license, and if it doesn't say that you can collect a fee, that you can't. So Berlin adopted back in 2017 a comprehensive license fee provision within their charter. It did pass, and it uses the exact same language. Moving through the subdivisions here to let you know what this would allow the town to collect fees for. This would be for the regulation or licensing of places of public resort. It's a much longer clause than that, but you get the idea. Lodging establishments, places of amusement, things like that. Places dispensing food and drink to the public, theaters, fireworks displays, public dances and musical performances, itinerant vendors, which would include peddlers. That's something that there is an express call out for a license in 2291. The exclusive occupancy of any specified portion of a public street. So reserving streets for certain events. Probably think of something like a art show or a farmer's market. The keeping of dogs or other pets and other activities that the town has the power to regulate or license by virtue of general law or this charter. There is an untested area of law here that I can't advise you on, and that is whether for some of these items, whether the statutory fees that the General Assembly has put in place would restrict the fees that the municipality is allowed to assess under this authority. We have a couple Supreme Court decisions that have stated that when possible, charter-specific authority will be harmonized with the general law. So they won't be read to be in conflict, they'll be read to be compatible. And in that case, that likely means that for things like dog licenses, the statutory fee is going to apply, but it may not allow the municipality to deviate from that statutory fee or permitting process, even where you have this charter-specific authority. The only way to kind of get around that would be to add a clause that says a city or town-specific fee that shall exceed or may exceed the fee established in statute. Did I get too far down the charter rabbit hole there?
You answered 7 of my questions. Thank you.
That was classic Tucker.
Yeah.
It's just like old times.
Mm-hmm. We're back. You wanted to be ready for this on Friday. We're back. All right. The next section, we're on page 3. This is the recall of select board members. We've covered this a bit in the past, in particular with S-181, and that was in 2021. There are at least 10 municipalities that have charter authority to establish and use a recall process for certain elected officials, usually the legislative body of the municipality. The most recent was the town of Underhill, which passed in 2021. This is very similar to the Underhill process, a little unique in some of the phrasing and some of the petition and voting requirements, which we'll go over, but it did borrow some procedural language from similar provisions in charters around things like petitions for ordinances. So starting in subsection A, first, 15% of the registered voters of the municipality have to sign a petition for a recall. And that is going to be based on the total number of registered voters at the preceding municipal election. In subsection B, within 60 days of receiving a valid petition, the select board has to call a special meeting, or if the annual meeting is going to be held within 60 days, to include a question for that annual meeting to vote on whether or not the officer that is subject to the recall petition shall be removed. The vote is to be held by Australian ballot. Here in the subsection B, this is one of the departures from the Underhill model. In the Underhill model, it's 45 days to act. Here it's 60. So a little more lenient in Essex. In subsection C, the select board member shall only be removed if at least as many registered voters of the town vote as voted in the election where the officer was elected, or at least 1/3 of the registered voters of the town vote, whichever is greater. So at minimum, you have to have a 1/3 voter turnout. Or if more than 1/3 voted at the proceeding or at the election where the officer was elected, you have to hit whatever that minimum threshold is. So if the officer was elected at an election where there was 37% voter turnout, you got to hit 37%.
Or else it's null and void.
Is the math mathing?
Yeah, so Tucker, I guess I want to ask, it seems interesting to have an election that has a minimum turnout number. Is that a provision that's in other recall charter statutes?
Yes, and it's also built into a few other procedures around reconsideration. So reconsideration of town issues in a few of the charters. And I can follow up with the committee and send some examples from other municipal charters.
Yeah, it seems interesting to have an official election, but the outcome of that election is only valid if a certain number of people show up. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
At the end of the subsection, the select board then names a successor in accordance with the replacement provisions of the charter. Subsection D, a little bit of protection here. You can only bring one recall petition within any 12-month period. So you get one bite at the apple per year,
Per individual, per
officer. Yeah, per individual.
So if 3 officers needed to be recalled, then have 3 in 1 year.
Yeah.
Yes,
One on each.
one on each. All right. Way more math than I was ready to do this afternoon. You're keeping me on my toes. All right. There's some cleanup in section 701, eliminating a reference to the Village of Essex Junction Graded School District and the Consolidated School District with the Town of Essex. Okay. Section 2. I have to say, this was, for last year, one of the most difficult drafting assignments that I had. And that is that the Essex Charter is fundamentally being reorganized. Sections are moving all over the place. And in order to accomplish that and give instructions to the publishers who make the green books, we have special redesignation provisions. And that entire section 2 is a way of stating to the people who will be publishing the volumes this summer, X section is moving to Y location. And I won't read through it because it's exhausting and it won't make any sense. But that's what this is doing, is it is moving sections within the town charter. And it took like 4 or 5 tries for me to get this right.
Noted.
Right. Toward the end of the charter, so we're moving to the bottom of page 6. The last substantive change that the town is moving away from a zoning board of adjustment and replacing it with a development review board. You have that substantive change within section 208 and section 6, where the reference to the zoning board of adjustment is repealed. And in section 5 on page 7, you have a transitional provision providing that the zoning board of adjustment in Essex will be replaced by the development review board, appointed by the town select board on January 1st, 2025. Excuse me, on or before January 1st, 2025. They'll have more than 24 hours to do it. This act takes effect on passage.
Right. Any questions on those sections for Mr. Anderson? I wanted to go back up and just make sure I understand some of what you said in section 1 on the license fees. So it's likely, if I understood your testimony right, that if there is a designated dollar amount for a fee in statute, that would be the required fee. That general statute would supersede the broad authority given here.
And thank you for using the term likely, because it helps me with my artful dodging of giving you a definitive legal answer. So we know that this will be interpreted to be harmonized with general law. There is authority here to fix license fees, but there are specific license fees for some of these licenses, including the dog licenses, right? Excuse me, dogs or wolf hybrids. So we do know what the fees are for that, what the division of the revenue from those fees are between the rabies fund and the town clerk. So that statute is so specific that it will likely control. And in the process of harmonizing the charter with the general law, it is likely that that fee set in statute is going to be the fee for a dog license.
How has that worked in practice with Berlin's similar language?
I don't know. And the reason I don't know is that I perused the Berlin website to pull up ordinances, and it does not appear that they've exercised a lot of this authority that is in their charter. They do have animal control ordinances, but I did not see very many ordinances that established license fees in Berlin, town-specific license fees. I didn't contact the town clerk, however. So if you would like, I can reach out to Berlin and see what they've done.
I think my other questions are all about the genesis of these things, and I will not trouble you with those. Anybody have any questions on the language for Tucker? Words on the page, Representative Byron?
Yes, we're done with the page, same section, and subsection 2. Just it's the way I'm understanding it, any of the licenses for dispensing food and drink to the public. So would this be license fees in addition to an additional license, in addition to existing state licenses and fees? Or does it?
Great question. I would be interested to know what the additional licenses or fees would be. Because as the committee is aware from comprehensive work in Title VII with alcoholic beverages, there's a very specific list of first third and fourth class license fees associated with bars and restaurants, right? So at least for dispensing alcoholic beverages to the public, the state has established a system for the issuance of those licenses and the specific fees that can be collected.
As is with the health license for the operation of a food establishment, that is a set fee by the state.
Similar to the Department of Health fees for lodging establishments.
Okay.
Great questions to ask, and maybe it would be worthwhile to talk to people in Berlin to see what their experience has been, because don't hold me to this, but I believe that when Berlin adopted their charter in 2017, Paul Gillies was someone who was involved. So they probably got, I would think they got a fair amount of legal advice at the time about what they could do with their fee provisions.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else for Tucker? All right, thanks so much, Tucker. Mr. Tucker? Would you like to come up together? Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having us. Greg Duggan, I'm the town manager for Essex. Andy Watts, chair of the select board. We've provided some written testimony. I'm happy to read that into the record from myself, from Andy, and from select board chair Tracy Delphia, but don't want to bore you if you've already had a chance to review that either. Whatever your preference.
I had a chance to take a look at the written testimony you gave. If you wouldn't mind summarizing it for the committee, I think that might be helpful. And then I imagine we have a bunch of questions.
So thank you for having us here today. Really appreciate the opportunity to come, for you taking the charter amendments under consideration. As you heard from Representative Black, this is something that has been a long process starting in 2022. With the separation of the Village of Essex Junction, the town select board had heard from residents that people wanted to take a look at the town of Essex charter. The select board created a charter review committee that went through their charter. They spent a ton of time. They met weekly to get through it. Made a number of recommended changes to the select board. In the interest of time and priority, the select board and staff looked at those changes. The select board decided to review and present and pursue the 5 changes that went to the voters in March. They made some adjustments from what the charter review committee had suggested. Went to the voters in March. All of those changes were approved unanimously. You heard the results of those votes. And so here we are before you today to try to answer some questions about some of the reasoning that went into it, the logic, and in hopes of getting them all approved.
All right. I have a bunch of questions about the sections. I'm wondering if it might make sense for us as a committee to maybe just start at the top and get a little bit of background about each one of these. So the first substantive provision has to do, of course, with the just cause eviction. And so I wanted to get a little bit of context for you all about how that was presented to the voters, given its broad authority and what the discussion was like in the community about, the impact that just cause eviction and tenant landlord policy being set at the local level might have.
Good. Yeah, so what was presented to the select board from our committee did include very explicit language that they asked us to include. As was mentioned earlier, we got that from our charter committee in December. Then having the need to warn that by the end of January, we were concerned about reviewing all of that language, getting it correct, or getting everybody happy with it, have all the public interaction we would need to come forward with very explicit language. And also the thought of whether the details of an ordinance, explicitly stating the details of an individual ordinance in our charter, the question about whether that was an appropriate way to do that. So 2 factors there. One was it was a lot of material to vet in a very short amount of time. And so it was proposed to just give
to request the authority to establish that ordinance independent of our charter. We also understood completely that the legislature is likely going to want to have some say in what language gets used anywhere in the state. And so that was where it ended up with just the simple authority. I guess it's not simple, but the authority to establish an ordinance.
I think Representative Higley's question to Tucker was probably alluding to that this is probably politically the stickiest part. So I'll be the one to kind of throw on the table that last biennium, the predecessor to this committee did pass a just cause eviction bill with very specific provisions that was vetoed by the governor and did not, was not, the veto was sustained if we didn't override the governor's veto. And I just wanted to ask you, as the representatives of the town of Essex, assuming that the governor's position has not changed, if it is your preference, and you don't have to tell me right now, for us to continue to work on other parts of the charter and set this aside, or whether you feel like this piece is so vital to the charter that you want to keep this all as one vehicle, knowing that if we pass this bill as one policy, it's very likely that this particular provision is not going to be supported by the governor.
It's been our expectation that this would be the sticking point of the entire bill, and that, yeah, I think we would be fine with setting it aside, and expect that there's to be a larger discussion about the authority to do to what we've asked for and or what language needs to go in there.
No, I agree with that. We certainly do not want the other parts of the charter to be held up or voted down because of the just cause eviction. As much as we can get approved, get passed, we would be thankful for, appreciative of.
That's really helpful. Thank you for your candor. Because that is definitely an issue that we are going to be wrestling with and talking about as we look at tenant and landlord policies statewide and, you know, with our colleagues up in general housing and other committees across the General Assembly. So anybody have any other questions on JC? Yeah, go ahead.
Just if I may, I understand that this is being presented as one bill. Each of these charter changes are voted on separately by our voters. So they didn't take it as one package. They took it as individual amendments.
Right.
When they voted.
All right. Any other questions on that section? Excellent. So the next up is the licensing fees section. I think if I made the mistake of clicking on to something else and now I need to get back to it. Okay. Yeah, so I read in the materials, the Q&A that you provided, that was really helpful, that the main motivator for the license fees, at least from the town clerk's perspective, it seemed, was to have the flexibility to charge more than the state specified fees. This is probably something, if we pass this as is out of GovOps, will go up to Ways and Means, and we might be getting out over our skis, even trying to delve too deeply into this. But I'm wondering if there are parts of this that are particularly sort of important or have been problematic, or if there's more of a story that we should know about the experience that you all are having in terms of covering the cost of administering some of these areas at the local level that we should take into account as we're looking at this section. And if there's anything in particular or more that we should know about, I could see us maybe trying to say something like, unless otherwise, you know, specified in statute, or maybe massaging this a little bit. I know this, you know, our colleagues in Ways and Means have a much better sense of how local and state fees work together, but didn't know if you wanted to give us any more color on this particular section.
Sure. The impetus was really the dog licensing and wolf hybrid. Get my language correct. That was really kind of the impetus behind the licensing fees. And so the process, just to quickly catch you up, with the charter review that we did was we asked all staff to take a look at the charter, flag anything, to send to the charter review committee, which then took a more in-depth look at things. The town clerk flagged the license section, I think it had come up as during our budgeting process at one point of looking at, do we increase our dog and wolf hybrid licensing fees? At the risk of getting some of our neighboring municipalities in trouble, I think there's some around us that do charge more than the state minimum or the state allowable fee. The Charter Review Committee took this up. They did some research. They found the Berlin Charter, that there might have been another one or two that they looked at as examples, and that's where this language came in. So they looked at adding the additional areas where the town could potentially charge fees, but it really started with the dog and wolf hybrid licensing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and so with the other items that are on here, to give more flexibility, I don't know actually which of these items has a fee, if they're a minimum or a maximum set elsewhere in statute. So I would leave that, I don't know, to our colleagues upstairs, I think, but I think I understand the gist of reading materials and.
Yeah, I don't, there's nothing that we have ready to go. We're gonna start charging for fireworks or anything. We're just, we saw it elsewhere. You didn't want to miss out on an opportunity if we're making charter changes. And so those other areas got wrapped in as well.
Any other questions about the fees section?
I actually just have a question. More broadly, just would be the current configuration between the two different municipalities. And this is kind of embarrassing for me to ask because I grew up off Sandhill Road. So what parts of Essex does this jurisdiction? Is this like just town? So like, does that include the fairgrounds? Is that
No.
town construction? Okay, because I know some of it buffers. There's like a little gray area over there where.
That's that New Year's Day thing. There's gonna be a buffer, but.
Yeah. So like outlets, that area, et cetera.
Yeah, there is the tree farm is jointly owned between the two, so I guess that may be a place.
That's right.
It's quite.
I know it gets like a little foggy in a few spots.
That little piece of land, that would be right, the outlets, outside of the.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking, I guess I will, fireworks displays and then traveling vendors and stuff like that, so I didn't, it's kind of like in that fair licensing and stuff, of that nature.
This is Representative Byron was not around for the birth of the city of Essex Junction conversation. He was on a different committee at that time.
Like you're just like getting to introduce myself in my home.
Yeah, and I also just want to make sure we're not reopening any old wounds as we go through both of these charters. Representative Water.
Thank you. Well, actually, I do have a question now, because that tree farm area, there are events there, correct?
Yes, yeah.
So then, do you have a policy in place or like who and where those fees go to, like which city or town?
We currently have a lease agreement, a management agreement with it's called the Tree Farm Management Group. It's a
Yeah.
separate nonprofit. They manage the facility, they host the events, so they collect the fees and they use that towards their operations.
Okay, so they wouldn't go to either the town or the city?
No, if they had a special event, like they were hosting a firework event or something like that, we do have a process, at least on the town side, of checking with the fire department, making sure there's public notice.
Yeah.
But they're more sports oriented at this point. There's cross country races, sports, soccer leagues, lacrosse, those types of things.
But if they chose to have a fireworks event, we don't yet have any sort of policy as to whether, since it's jointly owned, but there is a property line that goes through the middle of it. Who could,
Which side you're on?
could we charge a licensing fee for an event that if they're launched in the city and they explode over the town? I don't know. I mean, right? I don't think we have thought about how that. Maybe I should have brought up the tree farm.
I know, right? Well, it's just, I've been to a pile of lacrosse tournaments there. That's what I was thinking. But like the vendors and stuff, that wouldn't apply to like the food trucks or the people selling stuff, or would it? If I.
To my knowledge, there's not been any food truck events or those kind of things there, but I guess it's something we'd have to think about if there was an event on a property that's jointly owned, whose jurisdiction applies to what happens.
All right, we've gone way off on a tangent. I don't want to get too focused on jointly owned property, but Representative Hooper and then Representative Chase, go ahead. Representative Hooper.
I want to.
Is there a situation where under existing regulation, the state would charge a fee for something that you're now going to be able to piggyback another fee on top of it for vendors or other situations like that?
I would say that really the dog and wolf hybrid licensing is the really one that we focused on, because we had a short time frame between getting the proposed amendments from the review committee to sending it on the ballot for town meeting. We didn't, staff and the select board didn't really delve into exactly where the fees might be different from the state or what.
Actually, thinking more of vendors where the state health department issues a license for serving food, and then you might issue another one, which may not have happened before.
I guess I would say I don't have enough knowledge at this point to answer, unfortunately. Sorry.
I might just ask Tucker, really quickly, there are communities that have, peddler vendor license fees on top of any other fees that are charged by state agencies.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, the town of Shelburne is an example of a town that has a peddler fee ordinance.
Burlington does as well. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, we do in the city, so.
And the fees are all over the place. I know Winter James is like those. Burlington, it's exponentially more.
Okay, any other questions about the fees section? Mercifully, we're gonna go to the recall provision. So it sounded like a lot of this language was borrowed from your review committee on the recall section from existing recall provisions. The committee's probably aware that I cringe a little bit about recalls, but it seems like this one's kind of in line with what Underhill has, and maybe even has a little bit more of a window from what Tucker told us. But was there any particular context or color you want to give us on the recall provision sections?
So full disclosure, we had a resident come to us saying that he was gonna carry around a petition asking us to put the question on the ballot about recall. And so select board chose to take it up as part of the review committee so that the select board would control the language that went into it. There was a lot of concern among the select board members about ensuring that at least the number of people that voted somebody into an office needed to be voting them out. So that was a big piece of the whole percentage of, the number of voter participation in a recall vote.
It seems like it was fairly thoughtfully crafted to me, but anybody else on the committee have any questions about this particular recall language? I do like that safety provision. It's not one I really paid attention to when we were doing those other charges, and it seems to be a way to get at what my primary concern is with recall provisions, is that you're undoing something that happened at a regular election that voters are aware of with a special election that people may participate in. So that seems to address that concern, or at least attempt to. Nobody else on the recall pieces? I don't think anyone will have a lot of questions about the very complicated reorganization that seems technical. We'll try to
This select board for 10 years, and I still can't find stuff in our charter. So yeah, reorganizing it, I think, will help with people to understand where to start.
And thank you to Tucker for working through that and doing those edits. That was a lot.
Yeah.
Excellent. And I think the next substantive section has to do with going from the zoning board of abatement to the development review board. Does anybody have any questions about that section? Okay. That seems pretty straightforward from the materials you gave us, but is there anything we should know before we consider that section next week?
My only, the concern that has come up from some is the date, that there's a date certain for when it would take, that it has to be done by. It was voted on in March of this year, and here we are January this year. We have less than 12 months to complete. Maybe it's not a problem, but there are some who've raised the concern that the January 1st date.
So at least from, as you're representing the select board and staff, would it be helpful to you to have some more flexibility about the timing if we were gonna amend it?
There are many who would object if the date moved because there's a lot of people who are pretty adamant that they want to make sure it happens, that it's not just pushed out further. But I have a concern that if that date comes and goes and we haven't yet appointed enough people to fill the positions, what then happens? That's, I guess, not your problem.
But we don't want to put you in a position where we're putting something in statute that's impossible for you to complete either. So we'll take that under
There's a
advisement.
date in there, it's that early, because people were very anxious to make sure that it didn't get pushed out further.
Okay. Well, that might answer that question for us. All right. Is there anything else we should know before we delve into this further next week? I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. I just reiterate that it was, all the 5 of those questions were approved by voters, quite strongly. And, for that reason, thank you for taking it up and hope that they get approved.
Thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Great.
So committee, wanted to just, before these go out of our heads over the weekends, have a little bit of a committee discussion about proceeding with these charters. So my the agenda that you'll see that'll get posted shortly will show that we're going to take all these back up on Wednesday with possible markup and vote. And we'll also have the introduction and the initial presentation on the South Hero Charter, but not a markup and vote on that. So it seems like 141 and 516 are pretty straightforward. The Town of Essex Charter here, 518, it seems like we might have a little bit of work to do. How would where are folks at with some of the stickier provisions that we just talked about? Is there feelings about how we approach like the just cause and licensing pieces? I'm interested in the committee's feedback on some of the things we just heard. Representative
It might be good to reach out to Berlin to see what they did. I know Tucker mentioned that. Maybe they haven't done anything, but. And then, yeah, I think it would be important if they're anxious to have the other parts of the charter approved. We don't want to take a chance on it. Falling apart in the end, so I would remove the just cause eviction piece for now.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Okay, seeing some voices for taking out the just cause eviction piece and setting that aside for the time being. I support that. Okay. Other thoughts on that? Representative Waters?
Well, yeah, could they submit it as a separate charter change if they wanted to do more work on that, or if we did more work on that, and then they could do it like a separate thing? It wouldn't just be getting rid of it in total, right?
Right, and so they could do that if any legislators, if the delegation wanted to submit that as a separate bill, it's not subject to the deadlines for introduction or crossover, so they could submit a new bill. So if we remove that from this, they could put that before us again this biennium or in the future with a new bill.
Yeah.
So it's not taking it completely off the table, but for the purposes of our consideration here, I struggle a little bit with the blanket authority when, I know last biennium, there was a lot of thought that went into the trying to carve policy that made sense and held together coherently. And I know one of the governor's objections during that veto was, having a patchwork of different policies across the state. I'm somewhat sympathetic to that. And I also think there are things that we need to do to make evictions work better. And I know Representative Stevens is really anxious and interested to work on some of those tenant landlord issues up in the housing committee. So it's, I think that we'll be able to get the rest of the provisions worked on much faster if that is separate. I agree with Representative Higley on that. So, but I didn't want that to be, any kind of unilateral decision on my part, Representative Hooper.
I had my head spinning with that recall vote scheme, but I think our obligation to Vermont is to be consistent with things like the all charters, so the big difference between Burlington and this one seems to be a glaring opportunity to introduce consistency.
And so I think, does anybody want to ask our colleagues in Ways and Means about the license fee provisions? I'd love to delegate that to somebody. Anybody want to learn a little bit about how the municipal fees work with state minimums and maximums? It's a nice little project for somebody.
I can ask Matt those.
Yeah, are you interested in doing that? I would appreciate that, Representative Morgan.
Let's volunteer, thank you.
A little homework there.
That was quite the game of chicken.
Appreciate that.
I'll tell you
Yeah,
what, we'll already do that one together.
yeah.
Yeah, I'll catch it. We'll catch up Tuesday. Yeah, I'm really interested in that section. So as in like you and Baco.
If we do move that section, it will have to go to Ways and Means, so they'll have their opportunity, but I would love not to just send them something with no heads up. It won't be entirely unique, but it'll be, one of only two in the state. Okay. And it seemed like the other things were everything else was pretty straightforward. So, all right, great. Well, thank you all for diving in on this Friday afternoon. Anything else we need to talk about before we break for the weekend? We'll be back. We will be back on Tuesday afternoon to take up the Truth and Reconciliation bill and take testimony on that. Wednesday we'll work on charters, and I will be sending out an email with some language that will also get posted on the committee website for folks to look at. We won't be taking it up until the report comes out and the Ethics Commission has the opportunity to present it all to us. But I wanted to give folks the opportunity to circulate and look at the bill drafts for a committee bills for municipal code of ethics and a miscellaneous ethics bill to expand the Ethics Commission. These are recommendations from the State Ethics Commission. Representative Waters Evans and I worked with the executive director to look at trying to get their recommendations in the draft language. I wanted to give you all some time to look at that before we really take it up. So those will be up on the committee website, and we'll get those circulated so folks have a chance to look at it for a few days before we take it up the following week. Great. Thank you all for the good work this first week. I'm looking forward to